in crisis.
The podcast.
Hello, I'm Cathy Mason. I'm an assistant professor in philosophy at the Central European University.
And I am Fabio Lampert. I'm a postdoc in philosophy at the University of Vienna.
We're here today to talk about conspiracy theories, and with us is Keith Harris, who's also a postdoc in philosophy at the University of Vienna. Hello, Keith.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Keith, let's start from the beginning. Can you tell us what are conspiracy theories?
Yeah, so this turns out to be a somewhat controversial question among philosophers. So, according to the most simple sort of definition one might give, conspiracy theory is just a theory that alleges the existence of a conspiracy. So that would be maybe how you'd think about a dictionary definition of conspiracy theory. That turns out to be unsatisfying to some people because if that theory were correct, if that definition of conspiracy theory were correct, then there would be tons and tons of true conspiracy theories. And that's because there are many, many conspiracies that occur in real life. So many philosophers think that we need a somewhat narrower definition of conspiracy theories. And one way of motivating this view is to think about explanations of the September 11th attacks. So according to the official version of events, these attacks were carried out as a result of a conspiracy by Al-Qaeda. Most people would say, though, that claim that Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center on September 11th is not a conspiracy theory, even though it's a theory that alleges a conspiracy. On the other hand, theories that claim that, for example, the Bush administration was involved in the attacks, those are regarded as conspiracy theories. So what we need is a definition that excludes some theories from counting as conspiracy theories, but includes others. And so my preferred way of thinking about this is that a conspiracy theory is an allegation of conspiracy that is rejected by the relevant epistemic authorities, that is, people with expertise about the relevant subject matters.
Great. So could you say a bit more about what it is to allege that there's a conspiracy? Like, what are people thinking when they allege that there's a conspiracy going on?
Sure. So generally speaking, the idea is that a conspiracy theory is going to be a proposed explanation of some event, but it's a particular sort of explanation. It's a sort of explanation that invokes the occurrence of a conspiracy. So what that generally means is that a conspiracy theory claims that some event was caused as a result of a secret plan, usually a sort of malevolent secret plan, that's what a conspiracy is, to bring about that event. And so the idea is that when you explain something by appeal to a conspiracy theory, you're saying some people intended to bring about that event as a result of it happening, just as a product of chance or whatever.
Could you give us some examples of conspiracy theories that are actually accepted by people, things that people might have heard of?
Yeah, certainly. So especially in recent years, one conspiracy theory that's sort of gotten a lot of attention is the QAnon conspiracy theory. So this is a conspiracy theory that's sometimes people call it a big tent conspiracy theory because there are many, many different sorts of conspiratorial claims that are associated with QAnon. Now, the most narrow of these claims are basically that there is this cabal of government insiders who were secretly opposing Trump at every turn during his first term as U.S. president. But what people now mostly associate with QAnon is this broader and in some ways more outlandish allegation that, for example, prominent Democrats, world leaders, celebrities, and so on are involved in the systematic abuse of children. And so, of course, QAnon has gotten a lot of attention in part because of the sort of especially salacious nature of the conspiratorial allegations. So that's one of the more prominent theories. In addition to that, people might be familiar with all sorts of conspiracy theories having to do with COVID-19. So, for example, the idea that 5G towers were spreading illnesses or that the COVID-19 vaccines contained microchips. Those are both conspiracy theories.
So, if I understand correctly, conspiracy theories arise as an explanation for some big event, right? As a possible cause for the event that is so significant, like the terrorist attack in the US or elections, big elections, and so on. But what about things such as the Lake Ness monster or Bigfoot or things like those? Those don't seem to fit the usual way of thinking about conspiracy theories. But there's also this idea that the government knows that the Bigfoot exists, but he hides it somewhere, and so on. So are those also conspiratorial in some sense?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. First, I want to just pick up on the first thing you said, which was about the idea that typically conspiracy theories are explanations of some big events. And some researchers have suggested that why this happens is that for a lot of us, we're uncomfortable with the idea that big events can happen as a result of sheer chance or dumb luck or something like this. And so we'd prefer to live in a world where the big things that happen, say the assassination of a president or something like this, or the start of a war, that this is the result of some deliberate plan by powerful forces, as opposed to being, carried out by some random person or something like this. Turning to your second point, so you asked about claims that there's a Loch Ness Monster, for example, or Bigfoot. Do these count as conspiracy theories? So this turns out to be a little bit controversial just because in ordinary parlance we would often describe these as being conspiracy theories. Strictly speaking, those don't by themselves fit the definition of conspiracy theory that I gave at the beginning, and that's because the mere claim that there is this mythical creature, this Bigfoot or this Loch Ness Monster, that by itself is not an appeal to the existence of a conspiracy to explain some event. On the other hand, also, as you say, generally speaking, with these types of theories, there is the further allegation that there is some cover-up. So maybe there is a Loch Ness Monster, but this truth is being hidden, or maybe there's a Bigfoot, but this is hidden for some reason. And that's where you get into conspiracy theory territory. And generally speaking, the idea is that there is this hidden reality, and it's hidden not because we're sort of not trying hard enough to figure it out, but because there are forces that are trying to hide this from us. And that's what makes those conspiracy theories.
That's really interesting. I wonder if we could go back to perhaps the crazy conspiracy theories like the QAnon ones and ask you to say a bit more there. That seems such a bizarre theory for people to believe. How is it that you think people end up believing these kinds of things? What explains why people end up accepting those seemingly very strange explanations?
Good. The first thing to say on this point is that it's often not entirely clear whether or not people who claim to believe in something like QAnon really believe in it. So there seem to be cases in which people make claims to believe in conspiracy theories, but what they're doing is not really professing a sincere belief in the actual content of the theory, but instead what they're doing is expressing a sort of dissatisfaction with those parties who are claimed to be part of the conspiracy. So the idea, for example, is that when someone claims to think that the Democrats are involved in the systematic abuse of children, you might think that's not always a sincere belief, but what that is instead is just a way of expressing one's dissatisfaction or one's disgust with the Democratic Party, for example. So there are probably some people who claim to believe the theories but don't really believe them.
So is that idea that people are sort of pretending to believe these conspiracy theories, but they don't really believe it? Well, what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I think there are probably different things. So in the case of QAnon in particular, this theory sort of first appeared on these message boards online that are known for all sorts of kind of trolling and pranks and just what are sometimes called LARPs, so live action role plays, where people pretend to be government insiders sharing hidden information and so on. And so in those cases, it seems people are just sort of playing a game. And this is a game that all the people, at least initially involved, understood to be a game. Now, as the theory spread further, other people picked it up outside of those narrow groups of gamers. And in some cases, the motivations there seem to be expressing dissatisfaction for the political status quo, for example. And one way that this comes out is, for example, in survey responses, when people are asked, do you believe in QAnon or not? There's a suggestion that sometimes what people are doing is they're just claiming to believe things that they don't really believe because they want to just show that they think whatever is going on, whatever the status quo is, that's not acceptable.
Lots of conspiracy theories do seem completely crazy and irrational. So QAnon, for instance, I would think that I am justified in simply rejecting it, even if I don't have any evidence against it. It just seems so crazy, right? But are there conspiracy theories that turn out to be true?
Yeah, it's a good question. Now, in the way that people sometimes think about conspiracy theories, so sometimes people use the term just to mean like this false, kind of ridiculous theory. But at least according to the definition that I gave at the beginning, where a conspiracy theory is an allegation of conspiracy that's at odds with what the relevant epistemic authorities say, on that definition, it can turn out to be that some conspiracy theories are true. And that's just because epistemic authorities, these are people we regard to be experts. They might be, generally speaking, better than us at getting to the truth, but they're not perfect, and so they might make mistakes in some cases. And so there is at least the possibility that conspiracy theories sometimes turn out to be true.
Presumably a problem here is that lots of conspiracy theorists are calling into question people who we might otherwise regard as epistemic authorities and people whose word we might normally trust, and so you're in a kind of vicious cycle there.
Yeah, absolutely. So if one accepts a conspiracy theory, at least the way that I propose to understand them, then by definition one must think that the epistemic authorities are mistaken. And so what conspiracy theories do is that they force the believer, in a sense, to begin to distrust epistemic authorities, and that can cause all sorts of problems.
I was wondering about what makes conspiracy theories attractive. And there's something to the claim that if you're critical or if you're very rational, you shouldn't trust the information that you get all the time, perhaps on newspapers or from your friends and so on. So it seems like there is something epistemically or virtuous about believing conspiracy theories. If I tell you, hey, a revolution happened in a certain country, the people started a revolt against the tyrant, and you tell me, do you really believe that? That was just on the media. Perhaps there's something else going on that we don't know. It looks like you're kind of more critical. Is that something attractive or something that is behind the attractiveness of conspiracy theories?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the sorts of slogans that are often associated with conspiracy theorists, they'll often say things like, well, you should do your own research, think for yourself. The arch value there, you might say, is that what you want to avoid is just being dependent or being a sheep and following along with what other people think. And in a sense, conspiracy theorists are not alone in that. This is a sort of enlightenment value that people should think for themselves. But what seems to go wrong in the case of conspiracy theorists is that they take this a bit too far. So there's a sense in which we all have to rely on one another for some of what we believe. And if you try to avoid that, you might go down a bad path.
Yes, that seems right. Could you say a bit more about why... I mean, we've said about why people might sort of have these traits that lead them of wanting to be independent and so on, that might lead them to conspiracy theories. And you've given this kind of explanation that maybe people start off by not really fully believing the conspiracy theory, but sort of toying with it before they really do come to believe. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about why specifically people are drawn to these kinds of explanations that involve conspiracies. What's appealing or attractive about that? There are sort of all sorts of unorthodox explanations I might give, false unorthodox explanations that I might give, that have nothing to do with conspiracies. So is there a kind of explanation of why people are so drawn to this conspiratorial kind of explanations?
I think so. So my sense is that in order to operate in the world, all of us need to understand that a lot of what happens around us is the product of various people wanting it to happen in that way. But what seems to go on with conspiracy theorists is that they take this a bit too far and they think, nothing happens just by accident. Everything reflects the agency of other people. And so where many of us might look at some event like a plane crash and say, oh, there was a mechanical failure that caused the plane to go down, a conspiracy theorist looks at that and says, no, I don't think so. I think there must be human agency behind this. And so this generally sensible tendency to think, how could this event have been brought about by human agency, in a sense misfires in the case of some conspiracy theories where people look for agency where there isn't any.
Let me ask you something that I think about constantly. Academics, they would seem to be immune to conspiracy theories because they read academic articles, they read academic books. Intellectuals in general, they should be immune to this type of thinking. Conspiracy theories, very often, they don't provide good explanations. Very often they're just so fantastic and unbelievable. They have, say, a mark of falsity to them or something like that. But there's a long list of academics, of intellectuals, fellow travelers, political pilgrims, useful idiots. They're known for using, say, even their research for the benefit of not only conspiracy theories, but also propaganda and misinformation and things of the sort. Or they were just gullible. I am often scared about this prospect. When I see certain things on the news, I try to believe in the correct explanation. And I like to think that by reading the right books or the right sources, that's what I'll get. But that doesn't seem to be the case very often. Very often we actually end up believing in some conspiracy theory here and there. So what can we do, even as academics?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I think the unfortunate reality is that intelligence, knowledge, these are no sure defenses against ending up believing conspiracy theories and other sorts of outlandish falsehoods. I mean, in part, that's because, as we said earlier, some conspiracy theories have turned out to be true. And so we can't just say, well, that's a conspiracy theory, therefore there's no chance whatsoever it's correct. There is always this slim chance, and sometimes people might go too far with exaggerating the extent of that chance.
Okay, so let's say that I believe in a conspiracy theory and you know it, and I'm selling it to you. CIA killed JFK or something like that. Bush was involved in September 11 or something of the sort. What's the best thing to do when you see people believing in those things? Do you just counter with counter evidence? Do you just start arguing with them? What's the most effective way of countering conspiracy theories?
It turns out that it doesn't seem like merely countering with evidence is going to be very effective in these cases. There's a few reasons for that. One is that oftentimes once someone is absorbed in this process of thinking about the conspiracy, oftentimes they'll actually come to know a lot of granular facts about the event that you, if you're not already in this world, aren't going to know. And so if you try to beat them by just arguing about these facts, you're probably going to lose. At least certainly from their perspective, you're going to lose. I think the better bet is to think just about the track record of conspiracy theories as a whole. So there have been many, many conspiracy theories, and generally speaking, they turn out to be wrong, even when they seem compelling from the perspective of someone who's considered a lot of the evidence. And so a better way of thinking about this, I think, is to think in terms of, remember that a conspiracy theory is by definition something that the epistemic authorities disagree with, that their claims stand contrary to. And so insofar as we have confidence in our epistemic authorities, we ought to think that any given conspiracy theory is probably going to be wrong. Now, there are some contexts in which maybe the epistemic authorities aren't as good as one would like. So if you think about epistemic authorities, investigators, journalists, scientists, within authoritarian systems, their track records are probably not going to be so strong. And so the fact that they oppose a given claim won't be a great reason to think that that claim is mistaken. But insofar as we do have confidence in those that we regard as epistemic authorities, that's a pretty strong reason to think that any given conspiracy theory is probably going to be wrong.
Do you think there's any way of protecting ourselves against these kind of things on a more social or political level? Are there any structural kind of changes that are going to allow us socially to avoid these, or are they just an inevitability of life?
I think to some degree they are inevitable, just in the sense that, we do explain things in terms of human agency, and we ought to expect that in some cases that's going to be just the wrong way of explaining things. On the other hand, conspiracy theories in general are very closely tied to distrust. So if you believe in a conspiracy theory, you must distrust the epistemic authorities. So from my perspective, one thing that can be done, insofar as what we want to do is reduce belief in conspiracy theories, is to increase trust in epistemic authorities. And the way of doing that, generally speaking, would be to make sure that people who are sort of not themselves epistemic authorities in a specific domain, they still think that those within that domain have the right sort of competence and the right sort of motivations to make correct judgments when it comes to allegations of conspiracy.
As a philosopher researching conspiracy theory, what do you see as the role of philosophy or perhaps even academic research on this topic? Is it useful? Could it be helpful for people out there that don't know what to believe?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, one thing I should say is that when it comes to conspiracy theories, I think there is something, very attractive about this idea that you should be thinking for yourself and you should not just follow what the experts say or something like this. That's a very intuitive idea, I think. But by thinking about this a little bit more carefully through the sort of lens of epistemology, that is the study of knowledge, and by thinking about the fact that, reliance on what other people say is just unavoidable in all sorts of different contexts, that might help people to recognize that even though it seems like a good idea, just doing one's own research is not always going to be the best way of going about things. So just for a simple example, when you board a plane or something like this, you yourself don't carry out safety inspections prior to the flight, even though it really matters to you whether or not the plane is safe. But you don't do this because you're not qualified to do this. Whatever judgment you form about this is not going to be helpful to you. And I think when we generalize from this, we can recognize that across all sorts of different contexts, even though we might not like it, we are reliant on the claims of other people. And the same thing is true when it comes to allegations of conspiracy.
Do you have some piece of advice for listeners to end with about how they might avoid falling into believing in conspiracy theories?
Yeah, I think there are a few things we can do in this case. So one is, again, you don't want to fall into this idea that you should always be thinking for yourself. I mean, in a sense, it's a sensible thing to do to consider, what are the motivations of epistemic authorities in a particular case. Maybe you can get some grasp on that. But when it comes to investigating just the evidence on its face, that might not be super helpful. Another thing you can do is when you think about some new conspiracy theory that pops up, try to think back to all the other conspiracy theories that you've heard before and whether or not those turned out to be true. And I think when you consider the track records, you compare the track records of those we regard as epistemic authorities versus the track record of those things we regard as conspiracy theories, we'll find that the safer bet is going to be to bet on the authorities as opposed to the conspiracy theories.
Thank you, Keith.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This podcast has received funding from the Austrian Science Fund as part of the Knowledge in Crisis project. We're a collaboration of more than 50 philosophers at the University of Graz, the University of Salzburg, the University of Vienna, and are led by Central European University. For more information about our research and details about upcoming public events, visit www.knowledgeincrisis.com. You can also find us on most social media platforms at Knowledge Crisis. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next episode.